Good morning, everyone, except for those in Hong Kong. Good afternoon. Um, Welcome. My name is John Pepin. I'm Chief Executive of Philanthropy Impact, and it's my pleasure to uh, chair this webinar for the next hour. Um, our purpose as an organization is to increase the flow of capital for good. So we want more and better philanthropy and more and better impact investing with an emphasis on impact. So we're going to be talking about both those things today. And we also, our focus is on working with professional advisors, high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals. So that's wealth managers, private banks, tax and legal. But we also, as part of our network, philanthropists, impact investors, trust foundations, and charities. Professional advisors are really important. And a research that we did quite a while ago clearly indicated that if a professional advisor talks to their clients from a values-based perspective, that ultra high net worth will give 17 times more. So advisors are one of the keys to achieving this. Please note that in the Q&A, if you have any questions of the panel, to type them in there. And oh, sorry, that's old-fashioned. Word process them in there, and and we'll try and answer as many as we can. Okay, so let's start off with introductions. So, can both of you tell us who you are and organizations you work for?
So I'll start. My name is Sarah Hiley. I head up Walgate Family Office Services, which is wholly owned by Flaggate, a UK law firm, and we provide effectively outsourced family office services to high net worth clients for either those who want extra bandwidth for their existing family office or others that don't want the hassle or the cost of having their own. And of course, that includes helping them with their philanthropy and other impact matters.
Do you also support them around impact investing as opposed to ESG investing?
Yes, we do. We do.
Okay, that's good. So you operate across the spectrum of capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always a matter of facilitating. We're certainly not impact sort of, specialists, but we work closely with families to help them to achieve their impact objectives. Yeah.
Okay. Annalette, who are you?
Hi, so yes, I'm Annalette Walsh. I am the Director of Research at the Centre for Asian Philanthropy and Society. And we are based here in Hong Kong, but we work across Asia. And we are a nonprofit that was established in 2013 with a very similar mission as Philanthropy Impact to maximize private resources for public good. And the premise of our work is that there are models of philanthropy and ways of giving and motivations of giving in Asia that differ from those in the West, and that a lot of the knowledge and literature and examples that are available are based on the Western models and don't fully encapsulate what is happening on the ground here. That's what we try to do. We really try to uncover what is happening on the ground, what are the motivations for giving, what are the models for giving, for philanthropists, for business leaders, for companies here in Asia. And we do that through research, advisory, convening, and capacity building. As I said, we're based in Hong Kong, but working across 17 countries and economies in Asia. That's 15 countries in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And since our establishment, we've developed about 20 reports really on the full spectrum of giving, philanthropy, impact investing, and various topic areas. So really the full depth and breadth of philanthropic giving.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is a question to both of you. And I'd like you to talk a bit about philanthropy in your area. So UK, Europe, and across Asia. I know it's different from country to country, and as you know, in Europe plus also in Asia. But if you could sort of talk about what's involved in philanthropy, some of the key trends, what some of the opportunities are, where family philanthropy fits into all this. So, and why don't we start with you in Asia?
Sure, and thanks so much for that question. as you rightly said, it's difficult to generalize across Asia. It's obviously quite a lot of differences in different regions. But when it comes to family philanthropy, there are certain trends that we do see as similarities. And we recently published a report, which I can share the link to later, and I believe it's also on the website, which profiled 5 families from different countries and economies in Asia on their family giving. And from that, as well as from a broader research, we have seen some differences and similarities and some opportunities. One is in a way the variety of ways in which it's happening. There are families in Asia are giving through their private foundations, through their corporate foundations, through completely different mechanisms within one single family, and through funds, donor advised funds. So there is a really broad spectrum of giving. One interesting characteristic of family philanthropy, and this speaks to more philanthropy broadly in Asia, is that it is very closely linked with business. So many companies in Asia are still predominantly family owned. And so much of the wealth amongst families is still very much related to the business. And so when these families and business leaders are thinking about their philanthropy, they're not just thinking about their own giving, but also thinking about all the resources they have available to them, and often leveraging their business expertise, their networks, and the companies to help fit into that kind of their giving. So it's a much kind of more blurred line often. Another areas that we see is that it's very much focused on giving back to the community. Now, although that doesn't sound so different, of course, it's always giving back to community, but it's very localized. Giving back, there's a sense of giving back to the heritage, the place where I grew up, the place where I got wealthy, or where my business is. And rather than just tackling a single area like health or education, it's very much looking at the whole community. What can I do to help this community? And I will do everything that I can to help them, including building schools and helping with health, building clinics, like the full spectrum of things. And of course, there's also often a business interest, building relationships, and maybe supporting the area where the business is built. So there is, again, that kind of close interaction. And finally, one of the other things we found is really this importance of values that just underlines everything, of wanting to pass down these family values across generations, and that feeding into the vision and the strategy of the giving. There's a lot more to say, I'm sure will come up, but I'll pass over to Sarah here.
Well, just Sarah, just
Thank.
before you do that,
Mm.
um, you gave the impression that a significant number of families across Asia are involved in this. What percentage of families, or how?
Okay, so there are estimates. We don't have our own exact numbers. I just do have to look at my notes here. At the moment, and this is from some other sources, but Asia is currently home to about 26% of the global ultra high net worth rich, and it is among the highest growing regions. So the number of ultra high net worth individuals in the region has increased by more than 38% in the last few years, and it's expected to continue to rise. So I think that is important to understand in terms of the context in which this is happening. Some people sometimes refer to the 21st century as the Asian century, and there's a lot of evidence for that. There's so much growing wealth, the extreme wealth, but also the general kind of wealth among the middle class is growing. And with that wealth, we are also seeing increasing giving. And although the two are not necessarily linked, there are statistics to indicate that the large donations, as well as more general funding for philanthropic causes, is on the rise.
And just sir, one more question, Sarah. I'll get to you in a sec. But
Don't
um,
worry.
we're talking a lot about philanthropy, but where does impact investing fit in? And you can,
Absolutely. So when I
Sarah, all
say
these questions you can respond to.
yes. So when I use the word philanthropy, we use that as a broader term to the full spectrum of pure philanthropic giving, but also impact investing, venture philanthropy, different ways in which this money is being directed for good. And we are seeing some trends in that. The traditional mode of giving was very much grant giving, purely donations. But we're seeing there's some evidence to suggest that this is increasing with the second generation, more questions being well, partly the second generation or third generation, as well as the institutionalization of this giving, and I can come back to that a little bit later on. But as part of their process, thinking about the different ways in which resources can be used, and that includes impact investing. And there's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of talk about it. And I think the actual amount that is being mobilized is still quite limited. And I think that is partly due to a knowledge gap on the how to, as well as kind of investable projects and project pipelines and knowledge. But there's definitely a lot of interest, and there is a lot happening in that space.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sarah, sorry to keep you waiting so long. Can you talk about the trends and opportunities? Can you talk about UK, but are you able also to share some insights for philanthropy and impact investing across Europe?
I have to admit, I'm not so familiar on Europe, but I'll start with the UK, and then I'm sure, John, you've probably got some good stats at your fingertips that
Oh, no, sorry, I
can
don't get
help
to
us.
answer any questions. I just asked
Um,
the questions.
so, well, yeah, and I'm sure you've got plenty of answers, which I'm very grateful for. So, with regards to the UK, obviously my experience is somewhat skewed to the ultra high net worth sort of community, but actually, I was hearing a statistic from one of my clients actually on Tuesday, which is sort of the percentage of kind of wealth within that sector, and the percentage that actually that is given is less than 1%. So there's definitely scope for much more activity. And I think generally across the UK, actually giving levels are possibly dropping, and partly driven by the sort of social and economic instability that we're seeing kind of across the world. But with all that said, I think a lot of the points that Annalette has already raised, also apply. We have a range of different ways of giving, but also the kind of the areas, so the kind of looking at impact is certainly on the rise. But where I thought might be useful is to maybe highlight some of the differences as opposed to kind of repeating the same, which is,
Yeah.
it's interesting to see, and I think it's probably a cultural thing. The points that came up in your report, Annalette, and also that you've just highlighted now, the strong links to business in the UK, sorry, in Asia, as to the giving back to your local communities. I mean, of course, we do have corporate foundations in the UK, and and they will focus, no doubt, on similar matters. But in my experience with the sort of ultra high net worth community, they the foundations are much more focusing on sort of values-based products, so projects. So, for example, if a family or are particularly passionate about environment or social equality, there's usually more of a themed base to it rather than a sort of a community based. But I also do see that what clients of ours tend to do is they may have a larger pot, which will be based on the sort of values approach, and maybe a smaller to give back to their local community in a more discreet sort of private manner, maybe using a donor advised fund or community fund. Um, and then the other area that you talked on, which I think for me is a particular area of interest, is obviously the impact. I definitely think that there's certainly a rise in people talking about philanthropy and talking about pure grant making as part of a spectrum, and using impact first investing as a way of furthering their grant making. I don't really have much statistics as to how that is working, but I think there is, and I hope will become more so a greater drive to collaborating with other families and thinking about that sort of approach of a joined up approach and using that voice to drive private and public money into these spaces. I definitely don't think we're anywhere close to saying we're there yet, but there's definitely it's more in the dialogue and it's more in the people are thinking about it more, and I think in part that is rightly or wrongly in the UK. I think a lot of high net worths are using their philanthropic money to because they may feel that actually the government is not necessarily addressing these areas and they want to try and make a difference themselves.
Great. And let any comments to that?
Yeah, I can. Interesting that you mentioned that trend that you are maybe seeing about collaboration. I think that's an interesting point. And we also wrote a report on that a little while ago because it is a term that is very often very popular in the United States. Collaborative philanthropy is a very strong push for this idea that we should pool, well, maybe not pool, but that money can be used more strategically. Maybe we work together, it's pooled together. And it's an interesting view in that here we're not seeing a lot of appetite for that. What we're seeing is there are collaborations happening, but it is largely around, say, information sharing. And there is a reluctance to what we would call pool funds, because people do also have it, and that's, I think, culturally also more of a tendency of wanting to maintain control as well as having your name associated with that donation. Like, why would somebody put their money into a pooled fund, or if they can also do it themselves? So I think where it comes to opportunities here, we see more aligned funding. So where there is, rather than, and then we're seeing really this kind of collaboration, aligning or working together on sharing information on opportunities, and then perhaps aligning their funding. But there is still that tendency of going at it alone, and linked with that is, and we're seeing that as well with a lot of foundations, actually having this sense of we can actually do it better ourselves. And we're not even going to grant money to NGOs or charities to do it. We're actually going to do it ourselves. And so we're seeing a lot of foundations, even family foundations, transitioning from a grant-making foundation to an operating foundation, and which is quite an interesting development, especially in China and India. We're seeing that happening. So there is that sense of what we almost call do-it-yourself philanthropy. It's like we have the skills, the money, and the expertise, and we believe that we're the best people to solve for this, so we're just going to do it ourselves.
So,
That was,
okay,
sorry, go
sorry.
on.
No, go ahead, Sarah. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say that that's really interesting in as much as it is that that do-it-ourselves philanthropy. Are they doing that mostly in their locality? Is that going back to doing it yourself in your community, so one you know well, or are they doing that across the globe?
Well, a lot of these foundations operate locally or in their country. One that comes to mind immediately is the Priramal Foundation, which traditionally was a purely grant-making foundation, but they are now becoming much more a operating foundation. They took over some of the operations of Plan, I think it was Plan International or Care International. Maybe it was Care, anyway, a large NGO that was operating in India and left, and they took over that operation when it came to maternal health in India, and they are now running that fully themselves, and they are actually also, they're putting their own money towards, but they're also fundraising for that. Same in China, and I have to admit I don't have the actual statistics, but my colleague recently was speaking at an event and in China and asking the foundations how many there were actually operating as an operating foundation, and the number was quite high. And so, but they would largely be operating in their own region as well. So these are just two examples that come to mind.
It's interesting because if you look across Europe, the approach to philanthropy varies. And if we just take one example of foundations in UK, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, foundations quite often are established by businesses, and then they are there to do the philanthropic end of the business, and quite often it's sometimes a marketing tool, and sometimes not, and stuff. So am I going to get in trouble here now? I can tell. The Whereas in continental Europe, you have sometimes foundations set up and they actually own and control a business. So there's different models that exist. Um, but can both of you talk about the impact of the different approaches? Because is the impact being measured in terms of what's being achieved, or is it more a gut reaction?
So maybe I'll speak. I think
Yeah,
we in my experience, I see less of the sort of DIY approach. It's more still grant making that we're seeing, but there is definitely a desire. Well, there's a need actually because you have to report it, but the measurement of impact, and that's a very, very, as we all know, a very complex space and subject. And often, if you're grant making, you're reliant on your underlying grant recipients to help you with that. But I think one of the points though is actually going slightly back to the collaboration point, which is giving, if you can do some grant making which is unrestricted to your underlying charities, and allowing them the time to spend on collaborating with their counterparts, because unfortunately in the UK, and I'm sure worldwide, charities are effectively competing against each other. So there is limited, a capacity for them to collaborate. And actually, so they're all operating in silos. And actually, if the impact that could be created by allowing them to work collaboratively and join forces would be huge. But just going back to the measurement of the impact, I think there's a lot of thought going into it. I think as what we don't have are, and how could we, I suppose, is some sort of agreed metrics. At some point that they'll have to come down to something like that to allow us all to be measuring on a similar basis. But I think there's a lot of effort going into it. I think there's just not much consistency, and it's quite hard to see how that is going to move on. I don't know what your experience is, Annalette.
Yeah, it's similar. I think there are increasing questions raised about impact, and I think it's a natural and an important question to ask. I think there's less of the formal need oftentimes because there's not necessarily that. Maybe for corporate foundations, but for family foundations, this is not a requirement necessarily. But I think there is that sense of, and in our interviews in the study, the second generation or next gens that we were speaking to, and also at some of the events that we have, we hear them often talking about this. At the same time, exactly to your point, there is the difference between wanting to make sure that your dollars are going to have impact and how can you best do that, and having that recognition and realizing that actually that is very difficult in practice, and the lack of capacity for a foundation to either measure it themselves or for the implementing organization to do that is definitely lacking. So I think one thing that I think is very important always to what I try and say is it's looking much broader at what do you mean with impact, and it's maybe it's not about metrics and exactly about what you can measure, but making sure that your donation, your philanthropy is meaningful, and to also appreciate that the role of philanthropy or even impact investing can be to take risk. And with taking risk, it means also that you need to accept that sometimes that fails, but that doesn't mean that your dollar has failed. It means that you have supported an effort to trial something and that has failed. And now we're going to pivot and look at how we can do better. But that in itself is not failed impact. But that understanding in the corporate startup world, that is so well understood. Yes, fine, we're going to invest in you, and you're going to take risk, and then you pivot. That mindset doesn't exist in the philanthropic world, I feel, and I think it's important to keep that in mind.
So is there a lack of entrepreneurialism in the service delivery approach?
I don't. Are you?
Go on.
Oh, I
No,
was
no,
just
go
going to
for
say, I don't think so. Especially, I mean, we see a really thriving social entrepreneurship space.
Mm.
Governments in the region are also recognizing that there's a lot of support going into that. But there is some often a challenge between the funding needs for these organizations, that they are too small to receive real investments. The ticket sizes of the available investments are just too big for these small organizations to absorb, but there is no grant funding available then, because philanthropists are not maybe aware of that space as an area to direct their money. They're looking at the more traditional charities rather than, say, social enterprises. So I don't think it's a lack of entrepreneurial spirit. It is more a almost mismatch of funding and capacity.
I think the challenge in the UK is slightly different in as much as I think it's partly regulatory. And I know the Charity Commission has made changes recently to allow charities to make impact led investments. But when you sort of counter that against the responsibilities that a trustee has of making sure that the monies in the charity are put for public benefit. And so that sometimes there's a nervousness to deviate, sort of using they feel much more, still quite traditionally, much more comfortable with, a stocks and shares portfolio of assets that are then feeding the grant making, that rather than, which, if you want to look at it on a sort of a return basis, you've got your grant making, which of course will have impact, but it has no economic return to it. Whereas, if you were able to, and they're very comfortable with grant making, but because that's a well-trodden path. But then if you were to look at an impact first investment, maybe, like you say, taking that first loss piece in a innovative technology that's going to drive social change or environmental change, they're much more cautious. And that has been, that's partly, I think, in the UK, definitely around regulation and sort of disclosure. But I think it's also I think it's something that people are very interested to make change. And I think that if somehow there could be more support given to allow, without making, having trustees making sort of foolish, decisions. But if they're really thinking that this investment is a really mission aligned investment, and it will much, create far more impact to the actual grant making, it should be encouraged. So I think there is definitely entrepreneurial approach to it coming through. I don't think it's widespread, but I think there's definitely a growing trend in that area. Is that your experience as well, John, or are you seeing sort of?
No, I think it's, sorry, you're not supposed to ask me questions. Um,
Sorry.
Yeah, no. I think there is a growing trend. There's a definite push for trying to measure impact, especially reporting back to funders, which is extremely difficult to do because impact implies causal relationships, and most of the stuff that's being done is not it's not clear. So, for example, in our case, we want more and better philanthropy, we want more and better impact investing. Well, there's multiple causes to achieve that, and we're one. And so how do you do that? So we've had to do our impact analysis with funders in a slightly different way. So we can show indirect impact, we can show a lot of outcomes and that kind of thing. So it's very complicated. And
Mm.
another thing related to this, infrastructure support groups. Can we talk a bit about that for a second? Because I'm part of an international and very informal group that's looking at how they can get funding, because it's the most difficult thing to get funding for. Because if I go to someone to raise money, I'll just throw this out as a thing. I don't. It's a rational, logical argument I'm making. It's not, it's difficult to be emotive about an infrastructure support group because we don't have direct service delivery to whatever societal issue. Are you both finding issues around unrestricted funding and infrastructure support groups getting funding? So it's in fact two questions in one.
And I can jump in. Actually, one is to the answer. One is yes, and the other is no. Unrestricted funding, operational funding is a major issue across the region. The traditional model of giving is still project-related giving with minimal support for administrative overheads or operational support. And so every 2 years we do our flagship report called the Doing Good Index. It's essentially a mapping of the ease of doing good in Asia, looking at regulations, at taxes, and the ecosystem. And for that we survey what we call SDOs, so NGOs, social enterprises, and foundations in each of these countries and economies, and ask them about a lot of questions, experiential questions, operational questions, as well as funding questions. And every year we ask about the challenges around unrestricted funding, and consistently this is a problem. And the number of SDOs that say that they consistently receive operational support or unrestricted funding is quite low. If I recall correctly, it's less than 10% across the region, with some variation. The ones where it's slightly higher tend to be actually the ones that receive a lot of international funding, which seems to imply that international funders do have a little bit more flexibility around that. But it's a challenge everywhere.
Of course, international funding is being impacted by a lot of cutbacks in government
Exactly. So
funding.
that will have major impact, and I can come back to this. But interestingly enough, you were talking about these say maybe networks, or there are a lot of intermediary organization and net ecosystem builders. And yes, while these on one hand really also struggle to get support, we have been seeing some interest in some international funding. And again, that might change now in recent years, but that support in trying to recognize, to build this kind of network of organizations, and to try, rather than supporting just organizations themselves, money going to these capacity building organizations. I guess there's a thinking that maybe that can be more effective rather than trying to build the capacity of a single organization. Let's build the capacity of the capacity building organization, and it will trickle down. And again, I can't say that it's all these organizations are now no longer looking for funding, but we have quite a lot of them in our network, and there is definitely interest in helping build these kind of networks of organizations.
Yeah, and I think I would agree. The unrestricted grant making is definitely still a challenge. But I think there is a growing awareness that you have to allow people to do what they do. That there is an infrastructure. Everyone, it's quite mind-blowing, really, isn't it? When you think about how people have set up, they built businesses, and they know what it takes to run a business, and yet they still only want to fund a specific project without thinking about how that project is going to happen. But I think there is a growing understanding of that. But I think that is tensioned with this whole impact piece, which they want to be able to neatly say, well, I've given my money for this project and it achieved this. So it does definitely make that piece harder. To your question, John, around sort of organizational that are promoting sort of the wider philanthropic message, I honestly agree. It's incredibly hard, and I think people don't really think of that as an area to be giving grant making to, but completely agree it should be. And I think possibly people expect that to be funded by a sort of a subscription model from people like myself, or for organizations like ours. But that's an interesting challenge, and not one that I've seen one that has really been addressed.
It's interesting too, because at least something that both of you talked about a bit is around charities and getting funding. And there seems to be differences between Asia and the UK about that. But I've heard reports in the last few days that it's extremely difficult to raise funds now for charities in the UK. And it's going to have an impact on charities being able to deliver services or even survive. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, and John, if I can just jump in, I think that trend of this DIY philanthropy isn't helping either. If foundations are thinking actually I can do it myself better and are having their funding, you can even imagine a world where where people are that's like the way forward for philanthropy without passing judgment on whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I do think that the charity space is a very struggling wherever, even in countries where we're seeing a lot of rising wealth and even rising philanthropy. It is often still large ticket donations to certain organizations, often well established and well known organizations, and the grassroots smaller organizations are very much competing for a very limited pool of funds. So while the bigger picture is very positive about, yes, there's rising wealth, there's a rising philanthropy, there's a lot of interest, there's family offices, everyone's talking about philanthropy, everyone's talking about impact investing. At the same time, there is a lot of charities that are very much struggling to continue to survive.
It's interesting because several years ago, gosh, I think more than 10 or 15 years ago, I was doing some work in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and Thailand, and it was all around looking at um, encouraging social entrepreneurs and social enterprises, but also to a certain extent what the government would do in terms of service delivery. And I met with a whole range of very, very wealthy people who are in both countries who are very keen to get involved in an investment approach as opposed to a social investment approach as opposed to just giving away money for philanthropy. Um, is that still a trend over there, and is that a trend here to both of you?
I think yes. I think there is still that recognized by governments in several of the countries and economies from the government push to support social entrepreneurship, incentives for social enterprises to be set up. They get tax breaks and a lot of benefits. And so we're seeing that happening. We're also, and one of the questions we ask the our survey respondents is whether they are, first of all, whether they're a nonprofit or if they're revenue generating nonprofit or social enterprise. They're kind of gray lines, but there is a bit of a spectrum there. And we also ask whether they are, if they're not yet generating income, whether they are intending to generate income. And the exact number, I think it's about 60% of those who were not yet generating income are saying that they have the intention to start generating income in the next 2 years. So I think it is a reflection of that shrinking availability of grant funding and looking at other ways to become sustainable. And so maybe we're seeing a much larger shift towards more sustainable operating models.
What about Sarah? What's your comments on this?
Yeah, no, I would definitely say there is an interest in that. I think from the sort of social enterprise point of view, we definitely have a growing number of these, and I think that's again going back to the sort of filling the gap that the state may have previously operated in. But also there is, I think with the social enterprises, there's also a challenge as to effectively who sets them up and how well they're run. Because if you're coming at it, if because they're supposed to be self-funding ultimately while achieving good, and and that coming at that, you definitely need to have a very much a business mindset to that. And I think often they're set up by people who are traditionally been in the charity sector, and it's quite hard for them to move to be a bit more commercial in their approach. So, from experience, I've worked with families who have funded some of these social enterprises who, on the face of them, they should be absolutely flying. They're achieving great things and they've got great sort of public presence, but they are not run in a way that allows them to be commercially sustainable. So I think it's certainly a growing area of interest. I think there's many more people who want to set up in this space, and I think you know, much like the charity sector, there's a level of needing sort of some almost like private sector kind of knowledge transference. And that's another area actually that you know, we try and encourage our families is thinking about, when you're grant making or working in a thing is share your, you are brilliant business people. You must have been to have achieved the wealth you've achieved. So share some of that knowledge and help these institutions really benefit, be an active donor. You don't have to be in on the ground doing the actual grant making, but help them develop their commercial and sort of operational efficiencies.
Yeah, and if I can just tap in on that, I think the really interesting model that we do see, not very common, but it's definitely happening, is the venture philanthropy model, which is similar to that. It's based on the VC model, where a venture capitalist is investing in a startup, but rather than just providing funding, it's about providing long-term support. So when it comes to venture philanthropy, it might be initially grant and then loans and then maybe equity over time. And beyond just financial support, it's providing a lot of other forms of support, technical expertise, access to networks, access to perhaps other business expertise that they might have that's available to them, and seeing them through to a point where they become self-sustainable organizations. And of course, it's much easier said than done. But I think it is a really interesting way to think about, and even if you're thinking about impact, because all of a sudden, if you as the funder or the supporter, your impact is already in itself actually getting this organization to become sustainable. And then you can secondly measure your impact on whatever social issue it is addressing. So it is a way of thinking about very meaningful support for organizations.
So I'm going
Yeah,
to
no, I
ask it.
completely agree. No, go for it.
Caps. Do you measure your impact? Are people who are families who are in philanthropy, are social enterprises, or venture philanthropists, because there's an international organization that covers Asia for venture philanthropy. Are they using your research? Are you having an impact? I know it's
Well,
a really
I think
difficult
we're
question, but
we're in a similar
um,
situation as you, John, that it is difficult to measure our
mm,
impact as well as
yeah.
attribution. I think there are, for us, similar. We have to look at indirect attributions
Mm.
as well as indirect impact. But yes, we are absolutely seeing that happen, and we are seeing our findings. We are engaging with governments in the region, talking about our findings and policy findings. We are engaging with families, philanthropists, and business leaders. The change of behavior is the one part that is difficult to measure, and even if we could measure it, to attribute it, but we are, rather than just creating research and putting it out there for the world to read and to try and share. And we are very actively taking this to the audiences, speaking through our convenings with our large network of families and business leaders across Asia. And we are taking that to governments. Not all governments, we don't have access to all departments or governments, but in certain countries we have much better established relationships. We also work with partner organizations in all of these 17 economies that also take our findings, and they then take that to their networks of organizations and relations with governments. So, but again, it's indirect attribution.
Difficult. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's
it's
really
very difficult.
difficult.
Absolutely.
Very difficult. It's interesting because um, uh, on our 25th anniversary 2 years ago, we run events and stuff, and we decided that we would have just a little celebration at the Reform Club in Toronto. I'm sorry, Toronto, London. Geez, I've been here for 25 years. They don't have a Reform Club in Toronto. The and I thought, oh, it'd be lucky if we got 30 people. there just to come because there was no attractive speaker or anything like that. And um, we ended up with 150 people showing up. So we repeated it last year, and we had over 200. And then we decided blew the first year blew the budget completely. And then in the third this year, just a couple of weeks, a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, we repeated it again. And despite it being on a budget day, which the government didn't coordinate with us, we had 202 people show up, and it was a complete mixture. And it was just people getting together to share and stuff. So how do you measure the impact of that? It's really difficult. Sarah, is there an equivalent to caps that your firm and other firms can draw on information in the UK?
Well, you, John, philanthropy impact.
Okay,
I
thank
mean,
you.
no, but
I didn't pay you for that.
joking aside, it really is. I mean, it's a great resource, and it does, as you said, I've attended your events, and actually the one where you mentioned the 25 years, and actually it's just really nice to have that opportunity to speak on like you say, a sort of Chatham House rules and no active selling, but you get to, what's nice in that organization actually is that you've got charities as well as sort of advisors. You've got a whole mix, and I think that's a really healthy approach because what's very important, in my opinion, is having that mix of voices. Because if you end up with a whole bunch of advisors, then it ends up in this echo chamber. Similarly, for donors, it's useful for them to hear and share experiences. So yes, there are
Thank you
obviously
for the plug.
organizations. There you go.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That wasn't a setup. See what you're missing. I don't know. And
I'd love to join.
yeah, okay, you're welcome. We've you talked a bit about government at earlier on and the role of government. Just to make you aware, the government here is becoming extremely proactive around what they're calling the impact economy, and that's both philanthropic giving and impact investing, etc., plus local place-based kind of uh, philanthropy. They've set up an office, cabinet office on the impact economy. So they're quite serious about this. DCMS is doing a lot of work around this with that office as well. So there's a big shift in terms of the role of government trying to encourage encourage more what they call an impact economy. I don't know, Sarah, if you're picking up on any of that from your end.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. I think we can talk about the rise of B Corps, which I think that is definitely, you know, that is and you will shame me in again and ask me whether Flaggate is a B Corp, which it is not, which is
Oh, I
a
wasn't going to ask that
disappointment.
question.
But it's a great but it's a great way of growing that sort of social focus for business. But I also, yes, I do see some of the kind of grant makers that we work with are working closely in these sort of advocacy roles, looking at things like family justice and those areas, and they are working very closely with government on those actually. So I think that there is definitely an understanding that private private wealth and business has a massive role to play in these matters. Yeah, and I think the government is definitely alive to that, and I think that there is a joining of understanding that both have really important roles to play.
If I can just jump in here, because I think
Yeah.
the role of government is a really interesting point in Asia. And for anyone who has worked and lived here, it will probably come as no surprise if I say that governments loom large here and they play a much more important role in the sector in a very signaling way. And so when people just pay attention and tend to align themselves more. They don't want to necessarily butt heads with the governments, business leaders, large families and philanthropists don't want to go against the grain, but they align themselves with national priorities and plans. And on our Doing Good Index, the countries that do best and the economies that tend to sit in the highest, what we call cluster, which is the doing excellent or doing well cluster, have traditionally been Singapore and Taiwan. And these economies stand out because of the government's relationship with the social sector and the enabling regulations that they put forward, and recognizing the important role that the social sector has to play. Especially Singapore stands out with very enabling regulations, very generous tax incentives. They offer 250% tax deduction for charitable donation, which I don't believe is matched anywhere else in the world. And so,
did you say 250%?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And so it really is, it really does matter. And it's what we often say is that even say if taxes themselves are quite low, these tax incentives do matter because it's a very strong signaling effect. And when the governments in Asia put something like that in place, they're basically saying, we think this is a good thing. We think it's good if you donate money to the sector, and it has this kind of follow-on effect. And so the importance of these enabling and encouraging regulations in our view is extremely important.
Well, the UK government's moving in that direction, but I don't think they'll ever give a 250% deduction.
No, Singapore is very unmatched there,
Yeah.
and unlimited, and it's not to any limit, right? So it's in most other economies they will say it's like 100% rate, but and limited to say 30% of your income or 30% of your income, but it's also unlimited in. So theoretically, you can give it all away.
Okay, can I switch now, because basically we've been answering question number 1 all the way through. Well done. We did some research a while ago on Gen Z, millennials, and women of wealth. So all these are very, very wealthy people, and it was pretty intense research. So a lot of time was spent with them. And what came out of that research was really interesting. One was that they really wanted to do good with their money. So they want a values-based approach to their money, and that was across the spectrum of capital. So they saw philanthropy as a form of investment, no financial return. And then so a business case versus a case for support is really quite different. They also want to do impact investing. The second part of the research, we asked about their professional advisors, so their private client professional advisors, and all of them were disappointed with them. And that ties into some other research where when the next gen inherits money, they tend to change their advisors. And so that gets into a whole question about how a next gen is actually treated as part of a family. And I have lots of questions about that. But also it gets into a question about what the role of professional advisors are. Is there, do professional advisors, wealth managers, etc., in Asia play a significant role around values-based discussions? I'll come back to you, Sarah, in a second.
I think that, yeah, absolutely. There has been a real growth in this space, especially in the economies where there's been a real growth in the establishment of family offices, largely driven through governments. Hong Kong, Singapore have put a lot of effort into attracting family offices and wealth, and as a result, also put in place recognizing the need for advisors in this space, developing advisory services, and there's definitely a growth there. What we found in our study when we profiled the 5 families is that we saw a transition over time from a first to a second generation, where the first generation, and this is also linked to another study we did on ultra high net worth giving, the first generation tends to very much do it themselves, or maybe with some external help. But over time, as perhaps the efforts increase and they need more help and wanting to understand and more structured, go beyond just giving grants, but thinking more strategically, they bring in external advisors. And then especially as the family grows or next generation get involved, there is a need to think more strategically about the actual institutionalized giving. And that's where it may evolve into an actual institution, a family foundation, or more other forms of institutionalized giving. And as part of that, it's hiring professionals and it's hiring advisors. Now, one of the challenges that we do see, a lot of these advisors come from a background of wealth preservation or wealth creation, rather than the giving away or investing, philanthropic or impact investing. And there's a real lack of capacity in that space. There are now new courses being developed on philanthropy advisory or to fill that gap, but there is a lack of sufficient kind of people that can really advise these families on that side of their wealth management.
Sarah, I'm interested in your
Yeah,
perspective.
so I mean, thinking about a values-based approach within the sort of private client space, yeah, absolutely vital. 100% agree. Is it done across the board? No, definitely
No.
not. So, I think, I suppose the question is why not? Because ultimately, if you don't understand your client's values, how can you advise on tax? How can talk about estate planning? Yeah, there's so many different areas that actually, unless you understand their values, your advice is going to be suboptimal. So I suppose the question is, given how vital it is, why don't people tend to have those conversations? Well, I think it's a bit of cultural nervousness to it's quite a personal conversation to be having. That's how people may perceive it to be.
Plus, they don't know how to have the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's how do you bring that up when you're used to talking about, your default, let's say a tax advisor, the default for many, many years has been to minimize payment of tax. And they also feel that that's where they're adding their value because, that's a very measurable output, going back to their impact, although their impact is to save their clients money. Whereas actually, they might be giving far better advice if they had understood, well, actually, I have my passion is changing, driving societal change, and actually, and then they can have a different conversation, and it shapes that whole advice. So I think it's nervousness about stepping out of their lane, really, but also when you talk about the next gen, there's definitely an issue there because people recognize, we're going through the largest wealth transfer in history right now. And, if people aren't getting on board with the next gen, that's a problem for them.
Or women of wealth who now control 70% of the liquid assets. So yeah, it's really quite fascinating.
Exactly. Yeah.
We
Yeah,
we
no,
just
exactly. And those are both two areas who are very much more thinking about their values and their values led. So
yeah.
yeah, it's a vital piece, really.
Well, we
But
designed training to sort of reach out to advisors. So part of it is online training, and part of it is face to face. And the first module in the in the digital training is all around the changes that are taking place with Gen Z millennials and women of wealth, and advisors. We don't use these terms, but in effect, wake up to those changes. But also, what we mentioned is that with new regulatory issues here, with FCA, you have to be customer centric. Well, one way of managing being customer centric and the risk associated is to have values-based discussions. Look, we
Mm.
only have 1 minute left, and there's so much to talk about.
yeah.
So I'm going to, if it's okay with everyone, can we extend for another minute or two? Because I have a question I want to ask both of you. Are there any questions that I should have asked that I haven't asked?
Ooh. I think one of the ones that we talked about was I think it's been really interesting to think about the learnings that the UK and vice versa we could take from each other. And I think the points that I had written down was thinking about this concept of growing the sort of giving circle concept. So really that, for me, I would really really welcome if we could get more in the UK in this sort of collaboration of grant making, but also making that a multidisciplinary conversation. So having that sharing of knowledge and information from grant makers, charities, so that everybody can start to understand each other. I think we're all in the UK operating a lot in silos, and if they're doing that better in Asia, I think that would be great if we could learn from that.
Okay, so that's a question with the answer already. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anna, your
Um,
turn.
I mean, I think we could honestly go on talking for another hour here. I think we did touch upon a lot of things, but then maybe to tag on to the Sarah's point around what can we learn from each other. I think in general that mutual understanding of what is happening is so important, because regardless of which way, there are things to learn, and I think as Asia is also going through this massive wealth transfer, and where it although it has these unique characteristics, in the UK there are, for example, perhaps these more established advisory mechanisms in place, or institutionalized giving vehicles in place. We did a study previously, which I spoke on here about donor advised funds, that is only recently emerging in Asia, again with its own characteristics. But these are models or what is it, vehicles for giving that are really interesting and can provide an opportunity for new wealth to kind of, it's almost a way to start their giving journey and before establishing a much larger foundation. So these are just interesting things that I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn from. But in general, I think that mutual understanding of what is happening in different places is just really important.
This has been a brilliant and very fast hour. And
Absolutely.
thank you very much, both of you, for sharing insights and stuff. It was really quite fascinating. So thank you. And that's it. So, um,
Thank you, John, so much for inviting us.
oh,
Yeah,
okay, great.
thank you. It's been really
Okay.
interesting and great to have learned more about Asia. It's not an area I know much about, so thank you
And
so
likewise
much.
Yeah.
about the UK. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.